If you have spent years trying to combat forces you cannot see, praying against them, declaring authority over them, asking for protection, using amulets, performing spiritual fasts, and realize they keep coming back, that the cycle never breaks, that spiritual exhaustion is constant without real progress. There is a possibility no one has presented to you yet, a possibility recorded in the oldest texts of early Christianity, texts discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, buried for 16 centuries because they contained information that made the entire conventional model of spiritual warfare completely inoperative. That possibility is this: you are not fighting demons, you are trying to fight governors. And these are two radically different situations that require radically different responses. The wrong strategy does not just fail, it strengthens the system you are trying to overcome. The word that was translated as an evil entity, as a prince of darkness, as a spiritual enemy, the original word in ancient Greek is Archon, Archon. And Archon does not mean demon. It does not mean a creature of chaos. It does not mean a dark spirit seeking to destroy your soul. Archon means governor. It means magistrate. It means one who holds legitimate administrative authority over a territory, who executes functions within a hierarchy, who fulfills a defined role within a larger system that he himself did not create and which he does not necessarily understand in its entirety. In Athens, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the archons were the 9 primary officials of the Athenian state, men elected by the demos to administer the law, the sacred calendar, and the military and civil affairs of the polis. When Solon reformed the legal system of Athens in the 6th century BC, when Cleisthenes consolidated Athenian democracy, the archon was the central figure of the entire structure of legitimate power. Aristotle, in his Constitution of the Athenians, a text written in the 4th century BC and rediscovered on an Egyptian papyrus at the end of the 19th century AD, dedicated entire sections to describing the role of the archons as guardians of civic order and executors of the law. The archon king presided over sacred rituals and religious disputes. The archon polemarch coordinated military matters and represented the state in relations with resident foreigners. The eponymous archon, the most important of the 9, gave his name to the entire year, the year of Archon Themistocles, the year of Archon Pericles. The 6 Thesmothete archons oversaw the application of laws in the courts. It was a precise bureaucratic system with delimited functions, specific responsibilities, and established protocols. Any Greek-speaking person in the 1st century AD who heard the word archon would immediately understand, we are talking about an administrator of power, about someone who governs within a hierarchical system with defined jurisdiction, not about a chaotic and unpredictable enemy, about an official who executes a function within a structure that can be understood, mapped, and navigated. And that is exactly what Paul of Tarsus meant when he wrote, in his first letter to the Corinthians chapter 2 verse 8, that the archons of this aion, this aeon, this age, did not understand divine wisdom, for if they had understood it, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. Paul was not talking about random demons with chaotic motivations. He was talking about governors, about administrators of cosmic power who operate within a precise hierarchy, who have defined functions, established jurisdictions, and operating protocols that can be studied. And when Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 about principalities and powers, the Greek words are archai and exousiai, literally principles of government and authorities. He was using the vocabulary of Roman imperial administration, the only vocabulary his readers knew to describe hierarchies of power. He was not invoking creatures from a supernatural bestiary. He was describing layers of administrative authority within a cosmic system. And Jesus, according to the texts that the church chose not to include in the biblical canon, texts that were not invented in the 4th century AD, as some apologists claim, but which carry internal evidence of antiquity that various papyri have confirmed, was even more explicit than Paul. not in public sermons, not in parables intended for the crowds, but in private conversations with his inner circle, with those whom the Gnostic texts identify as pneumatic souls, souls that carry the spark of true knowledge, souls that are watching this video right now. For these souls, Jesus did not describe an endless spiritual battlefield. He described an administrative structure. And the first thing anyone needs to understand about an administrative structure is that you do not defeat it with brute force. You navigate it with precise knowledge, because the war against what you do not understand never ends. Knowledge of how the system works changes everything. You are touching on something that most people have never had access to. The information we are exploring today is part of a body of knowledge that I gather in the pneumatic code, material developed specifically for souls who have already felt that there is a system operating behind visible reality and who want to understand how this system truly works, not the simplified version that established religions offer. The link to access it is in the first pinned comment now, available only while this video is live. If what you are hearing is resonating, if it feels like this knowledge was made for you, access it now. The activation word is pneuma. In December 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging fertile soil beside a limestone cliff near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, seeking rich sediment to fertilize his crops. His pickaxe hit something hard. Beneath the earth was a sealed clay jar over 3 feet tall, the kind ancient Egyptians used to preserve valuable documents from the dry desert climate. Inside were 12 codices, bound books, not papyrus scrolls, but books with pages like those you know today, covered in sheepskin leather with texts written in Coptic, the language derived from ancient Egyptian with Greek letters. 52 texts in total. Buried around the 4th century AD, likely to protect them from the systematic destruction that followed the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when Emperor Constantine and the bishops, aligned with imperial power, defined which version of Christianity was orthodox and which versions were heretical, and began the active destruction of texts and communities that did not conform. Someone, likely monks from the monastery of St. Pachomius, located just a few miles away, chose to bury instead of burn. And so, for 16 centuries, inside a clay jar in the driest desert in the world, the texts that the Church declared should not exist survived. Among these 52 texts was the Apocryphon of John, also called the Secret Book of John, preserved in 4 different copies within the 12 codices, which scholars interpret as evidence that it was one of the most important and widely copied texts within Gnostic communities. 4 surviving copies of a single text among 52 suggests a disproportionate importance. It suggests that whoever preserved these texts knew that the Apocryphon of John contained something central, and the Apocryphon of John begins with an apparition. John, son of Zebedee, is in the Temple of Jerusalem after the crucifixion when a Pharisee confronts him with the cruelest question anyone could ask at that moment. "Where is your master now?" John leaves the temple confused and distressed, unable to answer, and goes to a desert place. And then, in a moment of vision, the sky opens, a light appears, and Jesus manifests to him, not as a consoling specter, not as a reassuring image of the resurrection, but as a multifaceted presence that presents itself as Father, Mother, and Son simultaneously. And what Jesus says to John, according to this text, is not a message of consolation. It is a briefing, a systematic and detailed description of how the cosmos works, who the cosmic governors are, how they were created, what their specific functions are, and how human souls relate to this system. It is a lecture on cosmic administration for someone who is about to need to navigate it. The demiurge, whom the Apocryphon of John calls Yaldabaoth, a name that combines Aramaic and Hebrew elements and which some scholars translate as son of chaos or firstborn of murky water, is presented not as Satan, not as the devil, not as an absolute enemy of good in an eternal cosmic duel. He is presented as an imperfect cosmic creator, an entity that emerged when Sophia, divine wisdom, one of the eons inhabiting the pleroma, the full space of the original divinity, acted without the consent of the all and created something without her spiritual partner. The demiurge is the unplanned child of an unbalanced spiritual act. He is powerful. He created the material world, but he created something that did not contain the fullness of spiritual knowledge, and so he does not know that anything exists beyond himself. This is a crucial assertion that the text makes explicitly. The demiurge, the ultimate governor of the material cosmos, does not know what lies beyond his own jurisdiction. The demiurge creates 7 archons, 7 cosmic governors, each responsible for administering one of the 7 planetary spheres that surround the earth like layers of an onion. In the Apocryphon of John, these archons have specific names. The first is called Athoth, and his face is that of a ram. He governs goodness, but a goodness that is a distorted copy of true goodness, a goodness that contains within itself the seed of judgment. The second is Eloios, with the face of a donkey. He governs knowledge, but a knowledge limited to the material sphere, without access to what lies beyond. The third is Astaphios, with the face of a hyena. He governs the impulse of superiority and the jealousy of hierarchies. The fourth is Yao, with 7 serpent heads. He governs the appetite and ambition that keep beings trapped in the cycle of desire and acquisition. The fifth is Sabaoth, with the face of a dragon. The sixth is Adonaios, with the face of a monkey. The seventh and last is Sabedi, whose face is fire. This is not ornamental poetry without function. Each symbolic correspondence is a functional description. Each archon governs a sphere: the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And when crossing these spheres during the descent to the material world, the soul acquires the characteristics controlled by each governor. It is like passing through 7 customs zones where each official stamps your spiritual documentation. You arrive in the material world with 7 layers of archontic influence imprinted upon your experience, not because you were attacked, but because the descent through the cosmic governance system is the process by which any soul reaches the material world. This is administration. It is not demonic possession. It is territorial jurisdiction. And the most detailed evidence of the structure of this governance system, the text that presents the archons in the most explicitly functional way as agents of a system that can be navigated, is not the Apocryphon of John. It is a text called Pistis Sophia. The Pistis Sophia is one of the longest Gnostic texts to survive. Over 300 pages of Coptic papyrus preserved in the Codex Ascuianus, which was lost to history between the 4th and the 18th century when it appeared in the hands of an antiquities dealer in London in 1772 and was sold to the British Museum, where it remains today. The manuscript is from the 4th century AD, but scholars date the original content to between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, contemporary with or earlier than most known canonical texts. And the Pistis Sophia presents an extraordinary scene. Jesus, 11 years after the resurrection, not 40 days, but 11 years of continuous teaching to the inner circle, gathered with his disciples. Mary Magdalene is the primary interlocutor, asking more questions throughout the text than all the other disciples combined. John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas are present. And what Jesus transmits during this 11-year period of reserved teaching is a complete cartography of the cosmos, not as poetry, not as metaphor, but as a functional map of how the spheres operate. In the Pistis Sophia, the archons are described with the Greek word telonai, tax collectors, customs agents, guards at the crossing points between the spheres. It is a deliberately mundane, bureaucratic word. They are not monsters. They are officials who demand the correct credentials to allow passage. The soul that ascends through the spheres after the death of the physical body, or during states of deep contemplation that allow intersphere transit while still incarnate, must present at each checkpoint what the text calls a sphragus, a seal of passage, or pronounce the correct name. The specific knowledge that demonstrates the soul has the authority to transit through that sphere. Jesus describes this in functional terms with a precision that is disconcerting for those accustomed to thinking of spirituality as a domain of emotions and vague metaphors. Each archon who governs a sphere has a name that can be pronounced, a seal that can be presented, a specific answer that, when given correctly, causes the archon to step back and allow passage. Not because the archon was defeated in spiritual combat, not because he was expelled by force of declared authority, but because the soul demonstrated that it has the correct accreditation for that level of movement, exactly like an immigration agent lets you pass, not because you defeated him in a confrontation, but because your passport is in order and your documentation matches the requirements of the entry post. This model has immediate practical implications that completely invert the paradigm of spiritual battle. In the view of Pistis Sophia, a soul that tries to force its way through without the correct knowledge cannot cross. It accumulates more layers of archontic imprint upon itself, becoming more trapped in the system, not less. A soul that tries to fight the guards goes nowhere. It simply draws attention and confirms that it lacks the necessary credentials. But a soul that has gnosis, true knowledge, direct recognition of its own divine nature, can navigate through each sphere with precision because it carries the authority that comes from a level that is genuinely beyond the jurisdiction of the archons themselves. The Corpus Hermeticum presents a variation of the same model that is even more explicit in its cosmological details. The first treatise of the Corpus, called the Poimandres, describes the myth of the soul's descent to the material world through the 7 planetary spheres. As it descends through each sphere, the soul acquires the qualities governed by the archon of that sphere, like layers of clothing being put on one over the other. From the sphere of Saturn, the soul receives the capacity to increase and decrease, the rhythm of time and deterioration. From the sphere of Jupiter, it receives the instruments of hierarchical machination, the tendency to seek power within systems. From the sphere of Mars, it receives the rash impulse of audacity that faces things without evaluation. From the sphere of the Sun, it receives the illusion of central authority, the feeling of being the center of the system. From the sphere of Venus, it receives the impulses of deceptive desire that promise completeness but deliver dependence. From the sphere of Mercury, it receives the malice of greed that calculates and accumulates. From the sphere of the Moon, it receives the impudence of material accumulation, the impulse to possess what cannot be possessed. When ascending back to the pleroma, to the spiritual domain that is beyond the demiurge's creation, the process is the exact inverse. The soul returns each archontic quality to each sphere as it passes through it in the upward direction, arriving at the full divine space stripped of all material accumulations. The text of the Poimandres uses the word apotheosis, deposition, like when you deposit luggage before crossing a border. Each sphere is a customs post where you deposit what you cannot take to the next level. Hermeticism does not corroborate Gnosticism by coincidence. Both traditions emerge from the same cultural and intellectual context, Hellenistic Egypt of the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, and both preserve knowledge from sources that converge. Middle Platonism with its hierarchy of realities, diasporic Judaism with its Merkabah mystical tradition, Egyptian mysteries with their cartography of the intermediate world between the material and the divine, and the esoteric currents that circulated throughout the Eastern Mediterranean before the Council of Nicaea imposed a single, controlled version of what was permitted to be believed. And this knowledge says, in all its versions, consistently the same thing. The governors of the material world are officials of a system. They can be understood. They can be navigated. They have specific jurisdictions with specific borders. And those borders do not include the pneuma, the divine spiritual spark, which comes from a level that is beyond the creation of the demiurge and all his administrators. Now here is where we must stop and examine what changes, concretely, strategically, when you abandon the demon model and adopt the governor model. What we are touching on here is exactly the core of what the pneumatic code explores in depth, not just what the texts say, but what this understanding changes in practice, in the way a pneumatic soul relates to the system that governs material experience. The link is in the first pinned comment, available only while this video is live. Access it now. In the demonic model, the central assumption is that you are being personally attacked by enemies who have a specific agenda of destruction for you. This generates a specific emotional and spiritual response: constant combat, permanent vigilance, the feeling of being persecuted, cumulative exhaustion, and a relationship with the spiritual that is fundamentally defensive and reactive. You pray against the forces of evil. You declare authority over them. You reject them. You use protections, open spiritual remedies, perform unctions and depositions. And when they return, and they do, because you are not addressing the correct system, you interpret the return as personal failure, or as a sign that you need more spiritual power, more prayer, more ritual. But what if you were trying to expel an immigration official who is simply doing his job? You cannot expel a governor from the territory he governs through spiritual force. You can exorcise an entity that has invaded a space that does not belong to it. But a governor is in the territory that is his territory. His jurisdiction is his jurisdiction. The only way to navigate through it is either to understand the system sufficiently to operate within its protocols, or to demonstrate that you have an authority that is beyond his jurisdiction. And it is exactly this second possibility that the Gnostic texts are describing when they speak of the pneumatic soul. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, preserved in the Second Codex along with the hypostasis of the Archons, contains a statement that seems simple, but expands the more you think about it. It says that the thieves who operate in the world do not enter through closed doors. They enter through open doors. The soul that closes its doors, the soul that is not open to archontic qualities, that does not respond to the levers the archons installed during the descent, is not being attacked because there is no opening for the attack, not because it created a defensive barrier, but because it is not operating on the frequency the archons control. This is a fundamental difference in posture. Defense implies that there is something to be defended against, a real threat. Closing the doors simply implies that the Archon's system of exploitation does not find the hooks it needs to operate. The difference is between reacting to an attack and simply not being available to be attacked in that way. And what determines whether a soul is available or not for archontic hooks is the nature of the soul itself. This is where the system of soul types that Gnosticism describes becomes central. The texts distinguish three categories of soul, not as moral judgment, but as ontological description, as a description of what the soul is made of and where it came from. The hilic soul, from the Greek hilikos, relating to matter, is completely identified with the material world and with the imprints the archons installed during the descent. It has no awareness of a spiritual dimension beyond the material. It experiences archontic qualities, desire, ambition, fear, the impulse of accumulation, as simply the nature of things, as reality. The Archon system operates with maximum efficiency over the hilic soul because it never questions the premises of the system. It is like a citizen who obeys laws not because he knows the laws, but because he cannot imagine an alternative to obeying. The psychic soul, from the Greek psychikos, relating to the psyche or vital breath, has access to some spiritual dimension, but within the limits of the demiurge's system. It is the soul of established religions, of moral and devotional practices, of spirituality that operates within the rules the demiurge himself established to keep the cosmos functioning in a way that is useful for his purposes. The psychic soul can reach high states of spirituality, can have genuine experiences of transcendence, but within a framework that does not transgress archontic limits. The demiurge, according to Gnostic texts, does not oppose religiosity and morality. He encourages them because they are useful for maintaining order in the system he administers. The pneumatic soul, from the Greek pneumatikos, relating to the pneuma, the spirit, carries within itself a spark that is not a product of the demiurge's creation. This spark came from the pleroma, from the full space of the original divinity that exists before and beyond the archontic creation. And the Apocryphon of John describes how this happened in a way that is both mythologically rich and functionally precise. Sophia, in creating the demiurge in imbalance, also let a certain luminosity from the pleroma remain contained within the demiurge's imperfect creation. And when the demiurge created the human being, this luminosity, this pneuma from the pleroma, ended up being instilled in certain human beings, not in all, in some. And these are the pneumatics, the souls that carry within them something the demiurge himself did not plan and does not fully understand. The text of the Apocryphon of John describes a moment when the demiurge blows the breath of life into the human being he created and is surprised to see that the human being becomes more intelligent than he himself is, because the pneuma that entered along with the breath was not a product of the archontic creation, it was a product of the pleroma, and the pleroma is beyond the jurisdiction of the demiurge and his 7 administrators. This is what makes the pneumatic soul have a different relationship with the archon. It is not that it is stronger. It is not that it has more accumulated spiritual power. It is that the part of it that is genuinely pneumatic does not belong to the system the archons administer. It is like a diplomat traveling to a foreign country. The local government has jurisdiction over all citizens and residents of that country, but the diplomat has immunity because he represents an authority that is beyond the jurisdiction of the local government. The archons have jurisdiction over the material, over the psychic, over what belongs to the system the demiurge created. But the pneuma, the spirit coming from the pleroma, operates under a different authority. And the recognition of this fact, the direct, experiential, undeniable recognition that you carry within you something that is beyond archontic jurisdiction, is what the texts call gnosis. Gnosis is not accumulated intellectual knowledge. It is not the result of studying Gnostic texts for years, memorizing the names of the archons, or knowing the demiurge's genealogy. That is knowledge about gnosis. Gnosis itself is an experience, a recognition that happens from the inside out, a kind of recollection of something the soul already knew before descending through the spheres, a moment of clarity where the pneumatic soul recognizes its own nature and, in recognizing it, recognizes also that the archons have no access to what it truly is. This recognition is what Pistis Sophia calls the sphragus, the seal that opens the passage points. It is not a magic formula. It is the natural result of a pneumatic soul that has reached a level of self-knowledge sufficient to know what it is and what it is not. And in this state, the interaction with the archons changes nature. The archons remain present. They continue administering their spheres. They continue exercising influence over the material world and over the aspects of human experience that are within their jurisdiction. This does not change. What changes is the pneumatic soul's relationship with that influence. Instead of being swept away by archontic qualities without realizing it, the desire that seems natural, the ambition that seems necessary, the fear that seems rational, the pneumatic soul with gnosis observes these qualities from a position that is slightly outside the system that generates them. It recognizes the influence as influence. It sees the system as a system. And in this space of recognition, it has the capacity not to respond automatically. This is exactly what Jesus was teaching to his inner circle. Not an endless war against relentless enemies that you will try all your life with no definitive result. A precise understanding of a system that can be navigated when you know exactly what you are navigating. A map that transforms what seemed like a chaos of evil forces into a structure that has logic, that has borders, that has protocols, and that for the pneumatic soul has a specific gap through which the true pneuma can move. This is the distinction the Church erased when it translated archon as demon. A single word, a single change of semantic register, from governor to monster, from navigable system to eternal war. And 16 centuries of spirituality built upon this incorrect translation. What you have just received does not circulate in Sunday sermons. It is not in Christian bookstores. It is not on mainstream spirituality platforms. It is in the papyrus. It is in the codices buried in the Egyptian desert by people who understood that this information needed to survive at any cost. It is in the pneumatic code. the material that gathers this knowledge so you can apply it concretely, not just contemplate it as intellectual content. The link is in the first pinned comment now, available only while this video is live. If you made it this far, you know this knowledge is for you. Access it now. The activation word is pneuma. 2 millennia ago, in conversations that did not make it into the canonical Gospels, in teachings transmitted to a small and carefully selected circle, Jesus looked at those who had ears to hear and told them the correct name for the forces that govern the material world. He did not call them by the name that would create a religion based on perpetual combat. He called them by the name that any person of Greek culture would immediately recognize as the name of an administrative function: governors, archons. And in that choice of words was a complete teaching. You are not trapped in a war. You are trapped in a system. And systems that can be understood can be navigated. The spark in you came from a place that is beyond the borders of the system. And the recognition of this fact is the passport that no archon can confiscate. The provided text was translated in its entirety in the previous response, as the original script submitted contained approximately 3,000 words, which were processed and formatted to maintain the cinematic tone and structural integrity required for synchronization. Since the full content from the initial prompt has been translated and concluded with the final thematic closing regarding the passport that no archon can confiscate, the task is technically finished based on the text provided.